So for those of you who just joined, I'm Sue Ostoff with the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women. And this is exciting because this is the very first webinar in our series from our newish project that's called Ending Mass Incarceration, Centralizing Racial Justice, and Developing Alternatives, the Role of Anti-Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Programs. And before we go further, I really want to thank the Office on Violence Against Women for the support of this webinar and for the support of this really interesting and amazing project. So thanks, OVW. So as you probably are aware, today's webinar is called Centering Our Work on Historically Marginalized Communities. And in an effort to save time, and I'm sorry there's so much text on that end, at the end of Jennifer's bio gets cut off. I'm not going to introduce our speakers. These bios are also posted on the Google Drive that we talked about earlier. Kelly Miller and Jennifer Martinez are both from the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence, and they promised me they were going to weave their own introductions into their presentation. So just a reminder, you two. I hope you guys who are participating can read the slide. But what I do want to say is that truly one of the high points of the last couple of years has been getting to know Kelly Miller and also a number of her coworkers, including Jennifer Martinez, and really to have the opportunity to hear about their amazing work that they're doing in Idaho. So I'm so glad that all of you are going to have this opportunity today. So just once again, if you have any questions, use that chat box in the bottom left-hand corner. Dot will be sending out information to all of you after this webinar talking about some of our upcoming webinars. We have one a week for the next 3 weeks, so we'll get that information out to you. A reminder, I'll be collecting questions for Kelly and Jennifer from the chat box, and we'll leave about 15 minutes at the end. So Kelly and Jennifer, thanks so much for sharing your work with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sue. Thanks so much for having us here today. I'm Kelly, and I'm Kelly Miller with the Idaho Coalition. Probably first and foremost, I think I'll just say I'm a human being, something that's been revealed to me over the course of time, and much more so these last few years. What I would say that I think that's important to know is I'm in Boise, Idaho right now. Spring is trying to break through here. It's a little bit cloudy. But the weather is starting to actually feel like spring, and Sue and Jen and I were sharing that we're all fairly shocked that we're actually into the month of May. So happy to be here with all of you, and just excited to share today both myself and my own journey and our organizational journey, and really bringing Jen's voice in when we're talking about our organizational journey and both our internal and external work on how we're really trying to and striving to center our work on historically marginalized communities. So I'm a mom of 2 grown daughters now, which is hard to imagine. My youngest, Hunter, is graduating from college like in a couple weeks. Yay, so no more college payments. Yay! And then my oldest daughter with her partner, Mandy, had bought a house and are doing well. And so, I mean, I think those are some of the, when I think about who I am, that comes to mind for me. Jen?
Hi everyone, this is Jennifer Martinez. I also go by Jen or Jenny or Jen M since we have another Jennifer here in the office. So I go by a lot of names, but I am also here in Boise, Idaho, but it's important to for people to know, or I always like to share that I didn't grow up in Boise. I grew up in a really small town here in rural Idaho, so that's definitely impacted who I am today and what I appreciate in terms of wanting to have a yard so I can raise cows again, because that's something I really enjoy doing, even though people think it's weird, but something I'm striving for. And just a little bit about me, I'm a part of that millennial generation. I didn't know that I was until about last year, which super surprised me because I thought I didn't know where I fit in really. I just got married last year. My husband is a Marine Corps veteran, served in Iraq, and he's a Head Start teacher, family advocate now. So we're just living life the best we can, helping people. And I have 2 dogs, no kids, but they're my fur babies, and they make me very happy after a long day at work. So that's a little bit about me as a human.
Thanks, Jen. So I'm going to spend the first 15 minutes or so talking a little bit about transformation in terms of how we're seeing transformation both at an individual level and an organizational level. And so the journey for me, it's really about how we are as human beings. And I'm working in a container called the State Coalition. It's the Idaho Domestic and Sexual Violence Coalition. And this conversation today is about how I've transformed, how we've transformed, and are continuing to transform, both as individual human beings in the organization and the way our coalition has transformed as a result of us. So it's a superhuman story, not in the way that we're superhuman beings, but superhuman in the way that there's multiple and conflicting truths, there's multiple ways of learning, and really messy and beautiful stuff all at the same time. So I think what would be important to know is that the State Coalition has been around since the early 90s. About the same time, many state coalitions were coming about as a result of important VAWA money. And that now we have, in the last few years, are really trying to strive to center our work on historically marginalized communities. And so what am I talking about there? I'm talking about folks in Idaho that are the Latinx population, the Native American population, the refugee population, the Black community in Idaho, as well as individuals with disabilities. In Idaho, there's a strong refugee community. There's also a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment that we're working around. And so it's, also the LGBTQ community. So it's anyone who's been othered, right? Othered, devalued, not seen as basically as a human being in our community. And so even in rural communities, we have and much like the rest of the country, we have a lot of work to do. And so how does this start? It really began with a personal journey. And so I'm going to, this is me in the far left corner. I told Sue when I was putting the slides together, I was thinking about the caterpillar because this is an icon that many state coalitions and national organizations coming together to talk about transformation have been holding on to. And there's me as a little tiny caterpillar. What I will tell you is I've been working in the anti-violence field for, over 30 years now. So that makes me old. And I'm white, not surprising, given how long I've been doing this work, and that the anti-violence field has been basically a reflection of the dominant white culture for many, many decades. And so I've been working in anti-violence both as an attorney with legal services over the years. I was also a prosecutor. When Sue and I first connected, we realized that I actually had prosecuted a woman back in the, I think it would have been in the 80s, that had killed her husband, and there was domestic violence that was part of her lived experience. And so Sue's organization had actually worked with this woman later on. So it's like coming full circle and a lot being revealed to myself, both in terms of harm that I've been a part of and harm that we're trying now to undo. And so when I think about this work and anti-violence, and I've been at the Idaho Coalition now for over 10 years, first as the legal director, and then the last almost 6 years now this summer as the executive director, what I'll have to say is the transformation that I have gone through in the last 4 to 5 years has really been revealing. It's things that were already there and seeds that I believe that are in each and every one of us, but it's things you have to uncover because the way our society is structured, that we're taught and we learn a different way of being that is not very human, frankly, and so a lot of this has been about unlearning. For me, I think the most important catalyst to lift up in terms of transformation and really understanding why it is that our work needs to center on historically marginalized communities was my privilege to participate in the Move to End Violence initiative. For those that haven't heard of the Move to End Violence initiative, it's a project, a 10-year initiative funded by the Novo Foundation, and they had a really compelling and I think I would describe a transformative and ever-evolving theory of change. So the Nobel Foundation was really looking at broadly how girls and women can be free from violence and be agents of change and leading the way towards a better world. And in 2010, they started this 10-year initiative called the Move to End Violence, which is really a movement-building program for change. And what they did is they spent a lot of time in a field study talking to folks, trying to find out what was needed, and they've been, continuing to evolve what they believe to be as needed as they've launched what they call cohorts. Cohorts is just a fancy word for like a group of about 20 people that come together for a 2-year intensive time where they're building and developing leadership skills, exploring practices around liberation and equity, particularly around race, equity, and liberation. They're helping to build strong, sustainable organizations, and they're really helping to introduce movement theory and practice and developing skills for social change. So Move to End Violence, I was part of cohort 2, so I'm like sandwiched in between Nan Stoops from the Washington State Coalition, who was part of cohort 1, and Karen Scott with the Vermont Network, who is part of cohort 3, along with David Lee from Calcutta. And so for 2 years, so this caterpillar, like the eyes are startled. I would say for 2 years, I was pretty startled. And the thing I would share that I was exposed to like 2 main buckets. One is just ways of being, and the other one was concepts. So ways of being. So when I came into the cohort experience, I would describe that, and look, I've got a lot of habits, and habits are these unconscious repetitive acts that I still have to work continuously to undo by replacing them with good practices. So what did my habits look like back when I began in cohort 2, which would have been in December 2012 to December 2014? Well, what you would see someone that worked easily 10 plus hours, 12 hours a day. Wouldn't be unusual to work 6-7 days a week, doing emails late at night. In order to sustain that, I probably was drinking 8 to 12 Diet Cokes a day. I remember during the Move to End Violence, they launched this 21 days of like healthy self-care practices. And their first story they shared was about a woman that would run to the restroom, and in order to save time, she would start unzipping her pants before she got to the restroom. I'm going to just disclose right now that was actually me. And one time I remember doing that and like someone coming the other way and not even be like aware of my surroundings. And so I think for me at that very moment in time, I had a very good friend, Lee, who has since passed away, and I remember sitting with her in the Seattle Cancer Care Center, and we're looking at a chart on the wall, and I'm seeing what fatigue looks like, and they're showing different levels of fatigue. And I remember having a thought in my head like, I don't see anybody laying flat out on the floor for fatigue, because there were different people in like chairs kind of slumped over, and I don't even think I had a sense back, 4 or 5 years ago that just how wrong all that thinking was. And so for me, through Move to End Violence, it was a process of uncovering and revealing my true self. And I still have a whole lot of work to do on this. But it was about things like, what does spaciousness actually feel like, and how can you actually be more creative and innovative and effective if you have time in your day to reflect? What the power of the breath can be, and how low and slow breathing can be such a grounding and powerful tool to connect your mind and body back together. Physical practice like movement and breath or Tai Chi, meditation, reflection, bringing joy back into my life. I think I am not unlike many others in the anti-violence field, where I think that this really kind of warped sense of self-sacrifice, where you let go of all the things that bring you joy. And so since then, I've been playing the piano more, doing art, reading fiction, and I'm still learning that I can eat knowing that I will eat again. So I still have much work to do, but I think that I'm going to really credit the Move to End Violence initiative for helping me to regain my really whole sense of being. The other piece I would say are the concepts that I was introduced were just really, I mean, some of these things I had seen and borne witness to in terms of the work I had done with legal services and both at the coalition, but I would describe this as going deeper, not broader, but going deeper. So really understanding what it means if we're thinking about gender violence, if we're thinking about the ways that violence and domination and extraction manifest themselves in our world, and what does it mean if we really understand that we want to do work that's even beyond intersectionality and understanding the impact of the ways that state violence and systemic oppressions are really impacting the individuals we wanted to serve. I will tell you that there were moments in time when I was going through this, and particularly when we're talking about race, equity, and liberation, where I wanted to flee. And what I will say, I just wanted to step away because sometimes the discomfort of the revealing of the worldview was really hard. And I say that as a white woman knowing that even the sense of wanting to step away comes from a great deal of privilege. So for me, it was about staying in the space and really being open to deeply listening and deeply hearing the stories of the other cohort members that I was so privileged to be in space with and community with for extended periods of time. I think what really changed for me, it was a lot. Beyond the way of being, it was also really looking at the way that we were functioning. I mean, the fatigue piece, the river analogy really spoke to me in terms of understanding that we were pulling people out of the river in the work that we're doing at state coalitions and all the anti-violence work around the country. And that, we knew in talking about prevention that we needed to move more upstream. I think what became more clear to me in going through my own change and transformation is we needed to look at who was in the middle of the river that we weren't even pulling out. And what I will tell you is I came to understand that the work that we were doing, the work that I had been doing, was really primarily serving white, middle-class, temporarily poor, heterosexual women, and that there are many people in the middle of the river that were experiencing multiple forms of oppression, whether or not we're talking about racism or homophobia, poverty, that they weren't even able to get to the edge. So this particular slide really speaks to me in terms of both the fatigue of the way we were being, in terms of, when you're pulling people out, how hard that can be, but also understanding that there were so many people, so many girls and women and people who were gender nonconforming, men, boys, that we were not even beginning to pull out of the river. And for me, that really had to change. At the same time, the transformation I was going through, I wasn't alone, and it wasn't because of just moved-in violence. It's happening across our country. And, amazing women like Beth Ritchie had been saying this for so many decades, and it just took me way too long to be able to hear it in the way where I could move to action. And I really, when I read Beth's book about arrested justice, she had a particular chapter about how we won the mainstream and lost the movement. And I remember reading that and just viscerally feeling it and really understanding particularly the role that I played as a prosecutor and the harm that had done in terms of attributing to and contributing to the over-incarceration that we have in our country, specifically with communities of color. It also just really kind of shook me to my core in terms of how we had professionalized the work that we were doing. And, and I say this with a great deal of respect for anyone with, education and degrees, but we have to understand that the way our country was constructed is that already set up the framework where we were, it just wasn't the right way to do it. We were professionalizing this field, and we weren't really looking at the lived experience, both of our own colleagues as well as the individuals we were trying to serve. And so we really needed to open up. I thought Beth's chapter was great. At the same time, I was going through the Move to End Violence cohort. Nan Stoops was bringing together groups of state coalitions and national organizations just on questions about, is this the kind of work we want to do? What else do we want to do differently? And this began to open up with Beth's work, so many other amazing women of color who have been doing work for a very long time, and making sure that I had to go back in time and read the critical writings from women through this bridge called My Back, and through the book that has all the writings of women of color, as well as Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde, and all the people who have really been saying much of what I'm talking about today for a very long time. I think one of the other concepts that came through my individual transformation, and all of this kind of like helped shift our organization, which we're going to get to here shortly, but the last girl concept came out of both my conversations through the Move to End Violence cohort, in particular when we went to India. And we were in India for several weeks and spent time with Ruchira Gupta with APNI App, who focuses on sex trafficking of girls and young women. And she and others in Move to End Violence were using the language around the last girl, and that is very conceptual. It's not a singular last girl. It wouldn't even necessarily have to be a girl. But we're talking about, based on Gandhi's work, who is the last person in our community that has the least resources, most pushed out, most othered, and in current times, who is most targeted, for harm and has the least opportunity to thrive. And so in thinking about this, I really had to reflect on the work I had been doing over the course of my lifetime, the work that we were leading at the Idaho Coalition, and starting to see more clearly that it really was about the lived reality of everybody, from staff, from the people we were trying to impact with our work, from the community and tribal domestic and sexual violence programs, that all of this had to be brought into play so we understood more clearly what was at stake and what real meaningful solutions would look like. So in the end, what I came to realize, it was about not just ending gender violence, but it's ending all of it. It's about gender violence being fueled and connected to multiple systemic oppressions. And so my worldview shifted. Many, many other people in the country, and I'm going to say specifically those that are members of the white dominant culture, have also begun to shift this worldview, and that gives me real hope. I think about Lori and folks in Iowa that are doing amazing work in Beth around really taking strong stances around not having additional criminal laws to increase that trajectory of over-incarceration. I think about the work that Patty Seeger is doing in Wisconsin around race, equity, and liberation, and taking a stance to make sure all their legislation goes through that lens of what's the impact on individuals, racial and ethnic minorities. When I think about Karen Tonscott-Scott and Nan Stoops and everybody I know who's really trying to do work differently, and especially the initiative that Sue is leading and that we're so honored to be the first workshop on and first webinar, and really naming that we have some work to do, and I see it as a historical course correction. And the next piece, at the same time, what I would say is that we also begin to go deeper on the root causes of violence and really understanding that all the ways that violence, extraction, and domination manifest itself in our country are very interconnected. And so both the root causes are going to be interconnected as well as the solutions. A couple pieces I'll lift up. I think it's so important to really understand the power of our culture of binary thinking, that, the right or wrong, that we can actually begin to find third ways by coming from a place of curiosity and wonder and asking questions and really listening, really listening and hearing one another and going deeper. I think our whole culture of competition over cooperation, and we see that in the nonprofit industrial complex and the funding structure, and that also fuels the narrative of scarcity, that inability to address fear, the whole question of hierarchy, which we're struggling with as an organization. It's like, so we know that hierarchy based on social identities, most of which are socially constructed, is one of our root causes of violence, and yet we have organizations that have high and deep hierarchies. And so how do we make sure that we're not mirroring and reflecting the kind of culture that's causing violence in the first place? So that was kind of like my journey. And so what I will tell you is about midway through the Move to End Violence cohort experience when I came back from India. I had a failed leadership moment when I came in, and they had encouraged us to take some time off, which I didn't heed because I'm still like undoing habits. And so I remember walking into the staff meeting and putting my head down on the table and just saying, everything has to change. Everything has to change. And then I left. Not something I would ever recommend. For some people on our team, I think they got excited. For others, they were terrified. And for me, it was also another lesson on learning, like you have to sometimes let things settle in before you can take them forward and have real conversations. And so what we're going to describe now, and I have Jen, who's been with us now for, how long have you been with us, Jen?
Oh, like 6 months?
Yeah. To kind of help reflect back and mirror kind of what she's observing in terms of our internal organization. What I will say is over the last several years, that some of it has been really lumpy. It's been really hard and messy. And we've had to really do a lot of deep, hard work as a staff. And so what does that look like? It looks like we actually commit time and resources to everybody's journey. It looks like we read books together. We have conversations about them. We do a lot of work that's been problematic, like we have done some racial identity caucusing. And you talk to employment lawyers out there, and that will freak them out. So you have to understand that as you go through this internal organizational transformation, in order to make sure that you can really center your work on historically marginalized communities, that you have to do your own internal work and not just do it for a little while, but it's ongoing and continuing, and we always have to deepen the work that we're doing. So for us, it's about that internal journey as staff and all the different ways that we needed to like change ourselves first before we could responsibly go out into communities and do the work that we knew that was needed so desperately in our state. And so when I think about the piece around trying the racial identity caucusing, it's about knowing where those organizational tools that you need in place. Like do your job descriptions, actually have language in there to make it a core aspect of that job, that examining privilege and oppression as it relates to your work is an essential element of the job. So we've had to learn as we've gone through this process to see what is needed internally in terms of how we are. So Jen, I'm going to invite you to come in and share a little bit about just your reflections on what you're seeing internally in the coalition.
Yeah, so I can start just by sharing just a little bit more on my exposure to the coalition leading up to becoming a staff member full time, and some of the reactions that I was having to that. So I didn't even know the coalition existed. Honestly, I mean, I've been doing a lot of progressive nonprofit type of work ever since I could, and I did not know that the coalition existed until about 2 years ago. A former coworker and friend invited me to come help talk on immigration issues and how undocumented women specifically are dealing with or have situations where there's domestic violence in the home and some of the immigration fears that come along with that. And it was really enlightening and honestly gave me hope to see that such a mainstream organization was doing the work to really understand how those communities that are often forgotten are impacted by the work that they're doing and how they can figure out how to provide support. And so that was my first interaction, and since then I had interacted in various different ways. But I knew I was drawn to the coalition, but I couldn't really put a finger on it, and it's still sometimes hard to describe even as a staff member. But what really brought me in was the fact that all of the staff and Kelly really took the time to get to know you as a human and as a person, and to understand like all of the experiences that you have had, how that contributes to how you see the work that you're doing, how it impacts the work that you're doing. And it really made me feel comfortable almost immediately when I started doing work. And when I got hired on and got to see more of the inner workings, it's unlike anywhere that I've ever worked before, where I feel like I can voice my opinion and it's actually heard. I feel like we can talk about the difficult situations that happen here in Idaho. And Kelly referenced earlier that we have a large refugee population here. We have 2 resettlement centers, one in Boise and one in Twin Falls, which is a smaller town of about 45,000 people. And there's a lot of anti-refugee settlement, a lot of anti-Muslim, anti-Islam sentiment that comes along with that. And having those conversations here in our office of not only how does this impact the work, but what's our responsibility to ensure that we're partnering and working with other organizations to ensure that these communities are being centered in everything we do is really amazing, and it gives me a lot of hope for the future. So those are some of the things I've seen. I've also seen some struggle, right? I mean, we all have different lived experiences, and that contributes to how we're reacting to certain things. So often there are situations that occur, whether it's through the news or something that happened locally, where some of us are taking it a little bit harder than others, and understanding how we can respect each other's feelings towards that and how we can support one another through that, and also struggling in terms of understanding someone else's perspective on an issue and really trying to work through that. So it's not always easy, but it's necessary, and really building that trust with one another to be able to have those difficult conversations, I think, is really essential to continue to progress in this way.
Thanks, Jen. Before we talk about kind of how we are together, I mean, I would just reflect back to that as I went through this, what I would describe as a transformation in that little caterpillar, I'm in that liquefaction stage. So as a caterpillar turns into a butterfly, the liquefaction is like really messy, really messy. And so for several years it's been really messy, and some days it still is here now, right? So I think I'm going to give a couple of examples to share. Like, we were doing a lot of work we needed to do and still need to do a lot of work around race, equity, and liberation, as well as, disability and other aspects of other identities that are marginalized in our communities. But it was really more than that. It was really understanding what is the white dominant culture that we have, and how did it come about in terms of colonization and the way that our country was founded on genocide of Native Americans and slavery of African Americans and the whole Western superiority. And so in many ways, for a couple of years, it's been this really deep history lesson of understanding our roots. And so from looking at Howard Zinn's work to following the leadership of many incredible women of color like Monica Dennis and Rachel Ibrahim, who have been doing the race, equity, liberation webinars every Friday of recent. I mean, we have a lot of work to do. What I will tell you that for many staff that particularly like myself had been hired at a time when we were really looking at degrees, we were looking at educational skill set, experience, and all of which is important and can actually exist across communities. We were advertising for positions in a way that reflected that we were a white dominant culture organization. So no surprise, several years ago, 5-6 years ago, we were primarily an organization comprised of white folks. And so we had some work to do around that. And I want to be so clear, this is not about diversity is a super low bar. We're not looking at that. We're not looking at numbers. So we decided that if we were going to be committed to really reaching and centering work on historically marginalized communities, that we needed the voices of people in this organization that are connected to organizations we were trying to reach, both to inform and influence the work in ways that I, who grew up in a white dominant culture as a white woman, could not see, and to hold us accountable and to really shape and shift the work that we're doing. And so our organization has changed. I will tell you that for some people, the change that we went through as an organization was hard and uncomfortable, super uncomfortable. And we had moments of failing forward. Every time we fail, we would learn. One of the examples that I'm thinking of is I had been out of town, and it was right after it was the day of the horrific Charleston massacre when so many people were killed in the church, a white man killing, women and men and young people, and it rocked and devastated so many people in our staff. What I found out when I came back the next day is white dominant culture habits are tough, and they're hard to break. And so we had the circumstance where most of the white staff didn't bring it up that day, at the same time that many staff of color were really struggling. And it should have been a struggle for everybody, right? And so we had to have a really big conversation next day about how does that feel when when events are happening in our own communities or homes, and we're not naming that, and we're not talking about it as real human beings. So we've had to do a lot of work. And I told Jen even this morning that white dominant culture habits are tough. I mean, I came into work yesterday and I'm thinking about deliverables, I'm thinking about deadlines, I'm thinking about document production, and and I have to breathe and step back away from that because it could be such a strong pull that I can forget that one of my colleagues next to me is grieving a grandmother that just died, right? So it's like an ongoing process. So go ahead, Jen.
I was going to say it's also a balance, right? Because the reality is for so many of us, we have deliverables and grants that we have to, achieve our goals on. And how do we balance that with still seeing each other as humans and still centering all of our work on marginalized populations, on the last girl? So it's a struggle. We just want to be really transparent about that. And I would also use another example of how we're continuing to learn, because it's an ongoing process. We're still learning a lot, and even with myself, I'm Latina. I identify as Latina, first generation, and we had an event last week where we hadn't asked on or posted anywhere for folks to let us know if they needed, on-site interpretation for the event, and that was a total thing that we were scrambling to figure out the day of, to get devices, to get people here to help us interpret. But because we had been doing the work for many years of building true relationships and partnerships with community, we knew where to go to get assistance right away, and we shouldn't have had to be in that situation in the first place, but we at least were able to recognize that it was a failing that we had and know where to go to get the resources instead of just throwing our hands up and not knowing what to do. So we're still adapting and learning constantly as we go on this journey.
Thanks, Jen. I think, I just want to make sure we're sharing when we've kind of had missteps, because that's been a big piece of learning. About 2 years ago, we were having a meeting of many folks coming together, and we had folks from the deaf community coming, and we had waited too late to get an ASL interpreter. So we had to cancel the meeting, and it's about owning it and telling the people we had to cancel the meeting because we fell short by not securing the necessary ASL interpreters in time. And so it's about learning and sharing with others as we're learning. I want to make sure that we touch base on, because I think this is so important, and I'm going to connect it to why we're trying to center our work on historically marginalized communities. But it is so essential how we come together as human beings within the organization, because if we are trying to do this work and we don't understand the complexities and the pressures from white dominant culture, whether or not it's around perfectionism, around the value of the written word, all the different ways that we manifest and we say that there's only one way to learn when we know that there's many ways to learn, from experience, from lived experience, from our ancestors, from storytelling, that we had to change how we were with one another. And so what does that look like? It looks like lots of ways. I'll have Jen share some of those around physical practice and breathing. But I would say it also changed in ways in terms of building the understanding and capacity of staff and what conferences we go to. We make sure folks, anyone that wants to go to Race Forward, goes to Race Forward. We're looking at Netroots this summer as another opportunity. We're sending folks to Insight and other places where they can have exposure and learning that they might not otherwise get from mainstream kind of anti-violence conferences. And at the same time, I will tell you, I've seen real shifts, both within RSP and NNEDV and other folks that are having convenings and making sure that women of color leadership is at the center of what we're learning and understanding. Because, look, as a white woman, I'll tell you that this has been told to us for many, many decades, and we just did not listen or hear. So, Jen, you want to share a little bit about what does it look like, feel like, in terms of how we come together?
Yeah. So one of the things that was interesting for me to kind of see and experience and practice when I started to work on staff was physical practice and breathing, because I've been so used to working in an environment where it's just go, 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 and I have to keep up with my boss to make sure that I'm working just as hard as they are, you know, and so kind of being able to be somewhere where we actually take time to all of us step away from our computers, we step away from our phones, we come together to practice breathing, a meditation really. So learning how to breathe again, even though it seems like, you know, it's something that we just do naturally, being able to learn to breathe really from your belly, from deep inside, and how that really grounds you and relaxes you and takes you away from that stress that we're constantly living in is really important. So every week we meet on Friday mornings and we practice together, and we do the breathing, and we also do physical practice, which if any of you have had a chance to do that with Norma Wong, you know it's pretty amazing. So we take the time to practice together in terms of how we move and leading into Tai Chi. And it was a little bit, honestly, it was a little weird for me at first because I didn't know why we were taking like half an hour outside of time that we could be working on something else to do this. But I was starting to see a difference in terms of how I was able to approach my work afterwards. I was much more calm. I wasn't as stressed out, and we were able to really build relationship with one another and community with one another. And it was a great way for me to get to know the staff who had already been here doing the work for many years, and also a new way of being. And now I can share this in all of the spaces that I go into outside of work as well, and take it to our programs as well when I'm traveling the state. So it's really been awesome to see. And we also are starting to do our practice group where we invite folks from the community who are interested in sharing this space with us and sharing this way of being with us here. So it's not just the staff. We have other folks who come in as well and do this with us. So it's been really, honestly, it's just cool to do that. Other things that we do, like Kelly said, we've been doing the race liberation webinars, and we're having lunch together afterwards every day. So we'll get lunch, we'll eat together, and we'll really just be present in that moment. So you really don't see anyone on their phones or anything, and if they are, it's usually because they're tweeting out what's happening or something like that. But it's been really an awesome experience to have, and really taking the time to, in staff meetings, show appreciation for one another, you know, a gratitude for someone who maybe helped you out a lot that week, or for just being an amazing person, and taking the time to acknowledge those things, because we're so quick to focus on the negative, but we don't take enough time to focus on the positive things that we do for one another.
Thanks, Jen. I mean, so from an organizational development and structure piece, I would share that also meant if we're actually going to see all of our colleagues as whole human beings, we needed to change the environment that we worked in. So anybody who wanted a standing desk got that. We have a proactive healthcare stipend now. Everyone gets $100 a month where they, as long as they're using it for something that's proactive around their health and well-being. We had to expand our parental leave to make sure it was 12 weeks paid leave. And so it was about, you know, seeing us in our entirety. And, you know, we were talking about dogs and cappuccino and children. And so staff who have had babies bring in their baby as long as they want, and we make it work. And we have one of our spaces that's basically child central. Mm-hmm. And, you know, so we love that and we enjoy that. And funny side story, we had a big community convening for a 2-floor building a couple weeks ago, and I'm hearing this like sound, like rolling back and forth. And we came up to check, and it was actually Thaddeus, our 6-month-old, who's with us in that one of those little bouncy chairs kind of rolling around on our wood floors. So it's about how we are with one another and how we come together with spaciousness and time. The other piece I want to add on, because there's so much good thinking about everything in the organization changes, that we also wanted to be sure that we had strong structural foundational documents to solidify this change. And it was also a way to work deeply with the board. So about 3 years ago, we started this process which was a 6-month process. We worked with a consultant, JDC Partnerships out of Oakland, and it was a small group of about 8 or 9 of us, so it was 4 or 5 staff, 3 or 4 board members, an external consultant, and 1 or 2 outside folks as well. And so we came together with really intensive time period, like for full days, multiple days, kind of working through what our theory of change was. And so this document is a representation of the theory of change. You also have a document, as I believe it's a PDF that Sue is going to send you or has already sent you. I think the important thing to know is they were really simple questions that we went really deep on. If you start at the bottom, we had to look at what are the values. And you don't want more than 5 because you can't hold on to them and you can't remember them. And you really want them to drive the organization. And so for us, and you can't read it on this slide, but you can see the other copy, it was about compassion and really understanding what do we mean by compassion. What we mean is turning towards others who are experiencing violence or oppression to interrupt it. Interconnection. Interconnection is the one for us that's been very important in terms of understanding how we're deeply interconnected to one another and to the earth. And so this has resulted in us making sure we're showing up around issues like around Standing Rock and climate change. Leading boldly, being able to take risks and go into the unknown. I mean, that's been like super important in a very, single narrative state that Idaho is so conservative that we have to be willing to take the chances to do what we know needs to happen. Social equity is so important for me on equity versus equality. That equity gives us that framework and understanding that not all people have the same access to resources and opportunities over history in our country. And so that recognize that historical arc of oppression and domination that we need to address both internally and externally in all of our work. And the last value in terms of core values is collective liberation. Liberation for me is just that concept of like freedom and freedom from oppression and being able to thrive fully and reach your full potential. And collective, that means that my liberation is tied up in the liberation of everyone else, including, and most importantly, the last girl. If you go from the bottom up to the next box, the next question was, what's the issue? Why does the Idaho Coalition exist? And we had to answer this. And it seems like so simple, but we felt it was important to use a gender violence framework and that also naming that it's fueled and connected to multiple intersecting systemic oppressions. And that also has shifted our work to understand that while we're addressing gender violence, we are also addressing racism and other ways that state violence and centering and other ways that systemic oppression occurs. Our focus, that means who are we held most accountable to in the end for our work? In the middle of this, right above all the different people, we named girls and women and people who are gender oppressed, understanding that gender is socially constructed, it's a binary in our country, and we need to break that open. And we also named youth and young adults because we see so much possibility in terms of organizing and mobilizing the movement. And that comes from a deep understanding that most social justice movements in our country and around the world have been led by young people. If you look at the first, I never thought of that. It's kind of like a McDonald's, like capitalist arch. Ouch. All right, so our strategies, these are like the approaches across the organization. So you'll see first and foremost, it's like centering solutions on the last girl. So when we think about the entirety of our work, we have a decision screen that we use to go through all of this. And this tells me about that all of our work, whether or not we're writing grants, whether or not we're having an event, even though we continue to fail forward by like not having the interpreters that we needed, but we did get them for that night, that should be what we're always having front and center. The next piece, which is much more traditional coalition work I would describe, is that building the capacity and prevention and response. The third piece around creating social norms to interrupt the root causes of gender violence fueled by multiple systemic oppression, gives us, sets up a lot of our prevention work. And the last one, when we first did this a few years ago, mobilizing the movement has a much different weight and definition to it now than it did when we first were working on this theory of change. And so what I would say is that mobilizing the movement has really taken on a life of its own with a great deal of traction. On the outside, in the context, I mean, that will ever be changing. I mean, the context of the landscape, of the environment, the political landscape that we're working in. But some of the things named in there are important, like our program and organizational members are essential partners to our work, and they're not, I mean, and they're all different. What I would say is that as we've done and gone through and continue to go through this change, our membership as a state coalition has changed and expanded, that all of our community and tribal programs are members, and we've always had organizational members, but that has really shifted to include organizations that are really connected to and working alongside marginalized communities. The North Star for us, which is just something that we always hold on to, when you have to encapsulate this document down to a single idea or vision, it's about liberation for the last girl. The changes we seek in the world at the very top, that's similar to like an organizational vision. And we're looking at compassionate communities with social equity and collective liberation, where everyone can see each other in their full humanity and their own selves and live to their full potential, where we have a world or a dominant narrative that's connected to interdependence, resilience, and regeneration. And so this document, I tell you this was tough. We went through this in 6 months. The board, and this is the hard part. You go with a small group that's open, ready, and willing to be able to do the kind of work you want, and it leaves other people feeling a little bit behind, even if you try to bring them into the conversation along the way. So we still had work to do after we passed this. The board passed it initially to do a full year of field testing as we were living into it. The board unanimously passed it, and I tell you, about 8 months in, or maybe even 7 months in, we started to get, for the first time, some fairly significant criticism being landed against our organization. And coming from political stances that we were taking around Ferguson, our work in support of Black Lives Matter. Jen, before she was with us, remembers a Compassionate Communities conference we had where we were giving out Black Girls Matter buttons because it was right after the young female high school student that had been dragged out of her desk in school. And so in solidarity with her, we were wearing buttons. So I will tell you, it was buttons and Facebook posts and some of that work that we were doing. It riled people up, and people were really uncomfortable. And so we, the board got some pretty significant pushback, and they had to figure out how they were going to take a stance. So it's so important for us to have this theory of change as a foundation as we went through these really kind of bumpy and lumpy kind of times. In the end, the board was able to come through it. I think they came through really strong and solid. And so you can see here on the end, so even internally, it's like understanding. This takes a little bit of the social ecological model from the CDC and thinking about the individual, relational, institutional, community, and societal level, and how this all works together in terms of creating violence and gender violence in particular in our communities.
And I think with that, we really have started to focus a lot of the work on the societal and institutional levels and the impact that has on the individual, because all of that is what's driving the narrative, and that is what we're ultimately, working to change and to challenge along the way. So with that, we're going to go ahead and move on to what has changed externally. So I can speak a little bit to, just because I was external and then I became internal, right, by becoming a staff member. So there was like this kind of vibe that you get from the coalition, that you just wanted to be around the people there because they were very authentic and very transparent in everything they were doing. And honestly, they were taking some really radical and awesome positions on issues that you don't see a lot of folks take in Idaho for obvious reasons. So that was something that was really awesome for me to see and something that drew me in. And then we started to notice that a lot of our work that we were doing was bringing in a lot of the social justice organizations that we were wanting to partner with and be in community with. And a lot of them have said the same thing, that there's just something about the way that we are and the way that we do our work, which is all centered on our theory of change and centering the last girl, that really appeals to them and that they want to work with and partner with us on. And as a result, the coalition has kind of become this, I wouldn't say the leader, but we are one of many organizations that are leading drastic changes, transformative movements here in Idaho, and we're really helping to share our way of being with those who are ready and willing to take that step with us. And if they're not ready, that's okay. You know, we're just trying to figure out how we can do the best work that we can do in partnership and community with others. And so we've kind of created this group that meets monthly to start to build really deep relationships and really start to talk about big transformative change and leading boldly in Idaho in a time where there's a lot of the feelings that Kelly mentioned previously, like the scarcity mindset in terms of funding and resources, and how do we challenge those things that we're seeing and feeling, with really understanding that together is how we're going to go ahead and do a lot of this work. So externally, I would say the coalition has become one of the leaders in organizing and in social justice work in Idaho, which I would not have thought of at least 2 or 3 years ago when I didn't even know the coalition existed. So it's been really amazing to see that and to see how being a group that is mainstream, really doing work in domestic violence and sexual assault field, how they're layering all of these other things that are happening, all these other multiple oppressions into the work that they're doing, because you can't separate it out. All of these oppressions are impacting one another and layering on one another, especially for those who are feeling multiple oppressions. So it's been an amazing journey to be on here with the coalition, and I'm still on my own journey here within the organization and outside as well. So that's kind of the external view from a lot of different groups and from a lot of different leaders here in Idaho.
Thanks, Jen. I would just add, much the way that Jen described, I mean, we've been like expanding. As our worldview shifted and expanded, so did our partnerships, right? So we still maintain our partnerships with what I would describe as the traditional coalition partnerships, many of which are embedded in criminal justice, healthcare, education, other governmental systems, non-governmental systems. But we've expanded where now we have strong relationships. I'm not even talking partnerships, relationships with the Latino organizations, with human rights organizations, with disability advocacy and LGBTQ organizations. We had, along the same lines, we had an opportunity, looks like someone lost audio, but I hope the rest have it, that we had an opportunity to move into a new space. And so then we started thinking about what kind of space do we want. And we had a desire and a vision to have a community space. And so we moved into an old linen building. It used to be a commercial steam laundry that had toxic, harmful working conditions for girls and women. And we wanted to reclaim this space and reimagine it as one for activism and engagement. And so our offices are upstairs in a 4,000 square foot space, and downstairs is an event space. And we have a bifurcated lease, but we worked with all of our other progressive organizations in the state and saying, okay, is this needed? And lo and behold, it has been very needed in the last several months. And so we've had the opportunity to be the host of community events with Planned Parenthood, with ACLU around Standing Rock, Transgender and Remembrance Day, and on and on. And so when I think about the mobilizing strategy, it's really expanded because our relationships have expanded, and we see them in their work and they see us in our work. And we've been able to leverage opportunities where organizational boundaries have just kind of dropped. An example would be there was a horrific incident of a sexual assault against a young black high school student with a disability, and really quickly we were able to mobilize the Black community, the disability community, the ACLU, and other human rights organizations, and really work together, which looked like super quick email, sharing databases, sharing media sources, for the ACLU to write a press release for us to understand strategically it was better to come from us. I mean, it's this really fluid and beautiful partnership that have really come out of this that have been really exciting. Last week we had our first healing conversation where we brought close to 130 people together to talk about this case out of Dietrich, Idaho, and it was powerful. And we had the deaf community there, so we had ASL interpreters. Thank goodness we figured out how to get the Spanish language interpreters there in time. But we had everyone coming in and talking about the way that discrimination, hate, and violence had impacted them as a listening session. And we had a really robust story to tell the Attorney General and the Superintendent of Education who, because we are a mainstream organization, were able to leverage our relationships to say, if we have these, will you listen to our stories? And they said yes. And so for us, it's about understanding the responsibility that we have with our resources and being able to share our resources, being able to be in relationship, a mutual relationship with people that is no longer transactional. So I think so much of this has changed.
And I would also say that I think that's one of the things that really has been drawing people in, not just to the space, but also just to our organization and to the staff here as people. It's the feeling that there's no, people feel territorial often when it comes to certain work, and that feeling's not there because we're really working together with folks and figuring out how we can move past that and breaking out of the silos that we've been working in for so long. I'm sure that doesn't happen just here in Idaho. I'm sure it's something that happens across the country in different states, and it shows up in different ways. But that's one of the things we've really been pushing, is that we can no longer afford to, in the environment that we're working in now, live in and work in silos. We really need to break down those barriers, like Kelly said, and build these really awesome fluid relationships where we're just moving forward in the best way possible for honestly those who are the most marginalized, so we can center them in other work that we do.
Thanks, Jen. So just kind of in recapping, I mean, because all of this was in service of being able to center our work and solutions on ending gender violence and other forms of multiple systemic oppressions in historically marginalized communities. It's about the impact of the work that we want to have over the course of the time I'm here, the time Jen is here, and the rest of our amazing colleagues that have been all in for this ride. What I would share too for staff is this impacted not only them personally and continues to do that, but it also impacts their families, their friends, and many relationships in some ways that I will say has been hard. So when I think about the external work, what this also means is that we write our grants much differently, our initiatives are different, our partners are different, the scope of the work is different, and we've been so just excited to see that so much of the federal funding already has been lifting up the need, and usually it's language around underserved communities and understanding the importance of language access, physical access, programmatic access, culturally relevant approaches. And so it was easy to make that shift because it was already there. We just weren't seeing it in the way that we needed to see it. So as we want to make sure we have enough time for questions, but I'll let Jen talk a little bit about what does this look like, in this year in terms of the activity and the mobilization and the work we've been doing.
So what you're seeing is a picture of the Women's March here in Boise. We had over 5,000 people show up for our march here. And as you can see, it was in the middle of a blizzard. Basically, it was cold, it was snowing, but there was so much energy. And what's really, I'm going to highlight a few different things about what was amazing about this march was that it was led by two high school students. They're 16, 17 years old. They were the catalyst for creating this here in Boise, which was amazing to see. And there was we were making sure that we provided space for them to be able to meet. We used our resources to print out signs for people to hold there at the march. We provided our event space that we talked about downstairs as a place for folks to gather to make signs prior to the march. Provided support in every way that we could, and we were there handing stuff out. It was an amazing feeling. And we also ensured that, the speakers were diverse, were from different communities, were from different experiences across the board, and it was really awesome to see. And I was I'm grateful that I was asked to be one of the speakers there, and it was really an amazing moment to be able to kind of talk about my lived experience as a first-generation Latina here in Idaho who grew up in rural Idaho, where the narrative so often is that rural America and rural Idaho is white, and I can assure you that it's not, especially where I grew up, which is very heavily agricultural in a large immigrant community, and coming from parents who crossed the border as undocumented immigrants, and the process that they've gone through with that. So being able to share that experience and expose folks who otherwise wouldn't be to that story and deliver it in English and in Spanish, to expose that reality as well was an amazing feeling, and something that I really appreciated, and am grateful that the coalition also ensured that we provided support to those two high school students, to Nora and Colette, and checked our own adultism whenever it was showing up in terms of planning for the march. So it was really an awesome thing to be a part of.
I think the piece that I would add too is that Jen and our other team were able to really engage in great conversations with Nora and Colette about how to make the march as accessible as we could, how to make sure that we're honoring the indigenous people that were on this land before it was colonized and taken over. And so you'll see in that photograph, it's one of our local tribal members that is opening up the march with a prayer.
Yeah, that's Ty Simpson. She's part of the Nez Perce tribe here in Idaho, and where we're at, Boise, is it's Shoshone and Paiute tribal land, and they were forced out. So honoring that narrative and that history was really important for us to do. And as you can see in the next picture, that's all of us underneath our little shelter from the snow there. But these are examples of the signs we created, what we provided. I don't even know how many buttons we made to hand out. And like the young folks in the back there are youth organizers who have been amazing to work with, and they really took an amazing role too with the two high school students in terms of ensuring accessibility was there, ensuring that young folks were really visible, and that the messages that they shared were messages that they felt included in and were a part of as well. So really an awesome experience for us here in Idaho. And then if we move on, sorry. This is the Black Lives Matter rally that happened here in Boise, and the coalition was present there. And those were current and former youth organizers and staff here from the coalition. And I wasn't there, so I'll let Kelly speak to kind of how that moment felt. But we've really that's part of our Leading Boldly. It's showing up to events like this with our name associated with all of this, and using that privilege that we have as a mainstream org to leverage these points.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jen. I mean, and so we have been doing prevention work, and like everything else, that also began to change, and also changed the youth that we were recruiting to be our youth activists and interns. Really shifting our focus away from healthy relationship work to youth organizing. And so this is reflective of the work that Buki and Dalton and Quee have been very much part of. The next slide, just as a quick touch, I want to make sure we have time for questions. I've seen some great questions about, this could be hard work, right? Which is why one of our values is that leading boldly. What we found is that leading with values, a values-based conversation, is something that that people can hear, even if they're coming from a traditional conservative community. And we have several, that's like a large part of Idaho. And so what has happened over the course of the time is we're learning from one another here in the organization and from all of our relationships with others is that our campaigns, our logos, everything has been changing. And so this is reflective of this year's youth campaign around, this was actually for teen dating violence awareness. And we knew what was needed because we were paying attention to the broader political landscape, is that we needed messages for our schools that were targeting the increased harassment and violence that was happening across multiple identities. And so we're specific in our prevention work to make sure that we're making more visible the young women of color in our state, and all the folks in the posters are actually youth that are either working with us or connected to us or volunteering with us. Fantasy on the left has been with us for over a year and a half now, an amazing young Latina woman. We knew it was important to lift up the anti-Muslim sentiment that was happening, the anti-refugee sentiment that was happening. And so you can see that in this we're talking about uniting across differences to overcome hate and violence, and about leading boldly, and that we're looking about valuing everyone for their humanity. So when we've been using a values-based approach, we believe it's important as an organization to understand the ideology and the various isms and the history of our conversation, but we're choosing to lead with many of our values because we believe that can bring more people in. I think the last couple slides, and we want to shift to the last 15 minutes for questions, but Jen, you want to talk about this one a little bit just in terms of all of our work now?
Yeah, so we're, like we said, we're centering all of our work on the last girl, on historically marginalized communities. And as a result, because we are taking everything into account, we're kind of present in all of these different groups and all of these different communities in terms of taking stances on immigration reform. Like I said, there was work done to understand how undocumented women specifically are impacted by domestic violence and sexual assault, and how we can, as a coalition and with our member programs as advocates, provide better resources and support there and a better cultural understanding. With regards to disability rights, just ensuring that there's accessibility across the board, and how can we ensure that people with disabilities who experience the highest rates of sexual assault, especially with young people, that we're able, sorry, you can't hear me. Like I was saying, with the disability rights community, we know that folks with disabilities experience the highest percentage of sexual assaults with young folks in our state. So how can we ensure that we're working with them to provide the most resources available, partnering with Planned Parenthood on healthcare issues. They partner with us in terms of the event space downstairs, and how do we ensure that they're taking an intersectional approach to the work that they're doing, and that the last girl is visible in all of the work that they do as well. So there's just a lot of examples there which we can provide more of, but I do want to make sure that we get to a place where we can have all of you ask your questions. So I'm going to just move on now.
All right, Sue. I've been seeing great questions. You want to ask us?
Okay. Becky Mastaki just put in a long one, so let me just start with the ones I had. First of all, I just really want to thank you for this really fabulous presentation, but more importantly for the work that you're doing and for sharing it with us. It's really exciting. And you've just been incredibly generous sharing it, both in written materials and talking about the challenges as well, and it's just been really fabulous. I do want to make a note to folks to say that the theory of change, that slide, is up on Google Docs, because I know that wasn't so easy to read, and you might want to go back to it. And they sent to us their strategic framework operational language handout, and I really encourage you to get that as well. If you have any troubles getting the documents from Google Drive, just let us know. I think one of the questions that I had in the beginning, and then a number of people jumped in sort of asking a similar thing, is if you could talk a little bit more about the pushback, the kind of pushback you got, like the board got, but also I think you did mention the board, but you didn't, I don't believe, talk about your member programs. So if you could talk just a little bit about that process.
Yes. Sue, great question. I mean, yes, we've had different moments of pushback. I will have to say that there's been moments I've been in parking lots just crying, but I've had people to reach out to for support. What I would say that this work is not for the faint of heart, and it is absolutely necessary. There is once you know what is needed, you can't turn back. And so, I mean, and we had been told that with the type of change that we were going to go through from some organizational development consultants, that there were always questions around pace, and there was tension around the pace of the rate of change. And what I had to sit with is that organizational development folks would tell you can only do change at such a pace before you start risking like internal dissension, external dissension, and at the same time I had colleagues who were predominantly staff of color who said, we can't wait. We can't wait any longer. And so we had to go at the pace that we felt like we could. We had been cautioned, and I would tell folks this, that some of the most opposition you can experience is from your own internal organization. And that was true for us. That was true for us, and we had to work through that. And those were really challenging and difficult times because I didn't want to leave anyone behind. I come from a belief that I don't think anyone's expendable. I think everyone's open and hopefully open to change. But we did have internal opposition. And what did that look like? That looked like complaints to the board. That looked like concerns around racial identity caucusing. And we just had to weather through that. We had to weather through that. And sometimes it took the assistance of an attorney to guide us. And I tell you, I had to go to attorneys, even though I am an attorney, outside the state of Idaho to find ways to be able to do this work to keep the organization intact. From our programs, we have 24 amazing community and tribal programs. I will tell you our relationships with our tribal programs has strengthened unbelievably because of the shift. And they'll say things like, we were waiting for you, right? And so knowing that we were getting a lot of affirmation from folks that were saying that, this is what we needed all along. We also had some community-based programs that struggled, not so much because they didn't want to do this kind of change themselves, because they were saying, we live in a community where this is going to be so hard. And then, not unlike many anti-violence organizations, many had really strong relationships with law enforcement and criminal justice systems, and this was challenging it to be out there in the forefront around Black Lives Matter and really naming state violence and talking about over-incarceration. So, I mean, I will say that it's hard work, but it is so absolutely necessary. I am happy to talk to anyone individually and help encourage them to go in this direction because it's what's needed. It's what's been called upon for us for many decades, and we just have to do it. For the community programs, I will tell you that we've seen a lot of shifts where they're much open to integrating changes within their own community-based programs and integrating social change into a social services delivery model. I will also make clear that this theory of change was about the Idaho Coalition and not about community and tribal domestic and sexual violence programs. But we are trying to influence and encourage them to move in a similar direction while still holding on to the social services aspects of their delivery model. So that looks like talking to them about bias and holding up race, equity, and liberation, understanding language access, understanding access for transgender community members. So it's about how do we use our resources to build the capacity of programs. It's really focused on how can we help them build relationships in community to better serve the individuals that they've not been able to reach.
And I just went and traveled the state and held 3 regional meetings for a grant I'm working on, and part of the work and of the questions we asked to help ensure the best delivery was who are the communities that exist that you are not servicing right now, or that are not coming in the door, and why do you think that is, and what barriers exist, and how can we overcome that together? How can we help you figure out how to provide those services, or figure out even like who to go to in your community to start to build relationships there. So there's still, I would say, some struggle there in terms of folks identifying who the last girl might be in their community, but they're definitely receptive to the idea of it and to at least exploring that concept. And it was definitely something that gave me hope to see that even in the most rural, remote parts of our state, those conversations are now happening.
Thank you. Heather asked, how can you stimulate discussions to begin this process, especially with less receptive audiences? And I also just want to sort of tie in a piece of this discussion you were having about working with the board when you were talking about the theory of change, and you mentioned that despite your efforts, some people ended up feeling left behind. And so I'm just wondering, like, looking back, are there things that you might have done differently to bring everyone along, or do you think that it's just sort of part of the process? So I saw those two as being connected.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think the first part of your question is like how to begin this conversation. I mean, one is thinking about who you're bringing in for your conferences. I saw that Becky Masaki's amazing. She's on this, posting questions, and somebody I continue to learn from. Casa Esperanza does amazing work, and we partner with them regularly and learn from all of their staff. So there's ways to begin to shift some of the messaging from your own organization. And I think it's just about, in the end, it's about relationships. It's about relationships and being able to sit down face to face with people and have conversations about, what kind of impact do you want to have? I mean, who is it you're trying to reach, and are there ways that you could be doing work differently to reach individuals who are, who've been historically marginalized by society, right? I think there's no single pathway or single right or wrong way to do this work. You just have to start from the area that you're most comfortable with. I always feel like relationships are essential, and that's the place where I tend to start. And I've learned to start, because sometimes I think years ago, Sue, I would have started from another place. But understanding in the end, it's really about each one of us as human beings and the responsibilities that we have by, where we are in life and what we've been given.
And I would also say that those relationships will help us identify the best ways to start those conversations. And there's also going to be folks who just aren't ready for that and who aren't willing to have those conversations yet. So it's knowing where do we best, put our energy and effort into, and where would that just be something that's ultimately harmful for us to kind of engage in those conversations.
Yeah. I think with regard to the board piece, I would add that as we knew we were going to do, and I knew once I had been going through this experience through Move to End Violence, that's what I needed to do if I was going to remain in this organization. And so it also began anytime we had a new board member position. I needed to make sure I had somebody on there who was open, ready, and willing to be part of this process. Mm-hmm. And so that was an important element. I think for it's hard. Would I have done it differently? That's hard to say. There's things I think we could have done better and predicted more clearly, but you can only move at the speed of trust, and you have to bring together people who are ready, willing, and open to do this change, both internally from your staff, from your board, from your member programs. And that's where the energy needs to be. It's not about leaving anybody behind, but you have to go where the energy and the openness is. So I'm not sure I would do it significantly different.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm aware we are nearing the end of our time. I'm just feeling like we should have a part 2, in all seriousness. Just the stuff you were talking about in terms of internal policies, that could be a webinar. And I also am curious if that's stuff that you can share and we can figure out ways of getting it out to people, like those questions that you include in your job descriptions and that $100 a month health allowances and how you figure out the stuff about the right furniture, so that internal stuff. Another thing I would love more information about, and I would suspect that other people on this webinar would too, is about the healing session, and just whether or not any of that was documented in terms of the process and the facilitation and what questions you had and what you did to make that work. And I hear you say over and over a lot of it's about relationships, so I do understand that's at the core. Also just the transformation of, you know, it was not that long ago that you were doing teen dating Violence Awareness Month stuff, and now your We Choose All of Us campaign is out there in this bold, beautiful way, and how that transformation happened in a relatively short period of time. So can we have you back?
Jen, what do you think?
I'm down. Yes.
Because we did not get to all the questions, as you saw, you know, and I think that, you know, one of those at the end is, you know, the struggle between wanting to do this transformational work and also meeting the needs of what's going on in your communities.
No. And know that we don't do this alone. I mean, there's so many women, and particularly women of color out there, Joanne Smith and others who've been an inspiration and a resource and a model, Becky Masaki, Patty, I mean, so many folks. And we have Jen Martinez right here next to me and so many amazing staff. So happy to share, you know, both the ickiness and the hardness and the amazing work that we're able to do.
Thank you so much. This has been fabulous. And so we will talk to actually figure out if we can do a part 2, and also to figure out if there's a way of sharing some of the materials that you talked about with our participants today. So also Facebook, I do see that. So thank you very much, Kelly and Jennifer, for sharing this really important journey with all of us. So thank you, and we'll talk soon. Thank you all for participating today.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks.